In his State of the Union address, President Biden alluded to the Chinese spy balloon incident in a single line, which suggested an effort to contain the spillover from that episode.
As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
For its part, the Beijing government also seems to have tried to downplay it, expressing regret initially and using its censorship of media and social media not to fan the flames of Chinese nationalism, but rather tamp them down. In the last such crisis, the Chinese government seemed to encourage anti-Americanism in its media. In 2001, an American spy plane collided with a Chinese jet fighter, killing the Chinese pilot and forcing the American plane to land at Hainan Island, where Chinese authorities took the crew into custody. After 11 tense days, the United States issued a letter of regret, which the Chinese characterized as an apology. Beijing then released the Americans. It is difficult to imagine an incident like that one getting resolved so quickly and easily today. We're watching something almost unique in history, a growing geopolitical rivalry between two nations that are also deeply interconnected economically. In the wake of the suspected spy balloon, this week brought news that U.S.-China trade in goods hit an all-time high of $690 billion, surpassing the previous record set in 2018 before the COVID pandemic. That number seems especially remarkable when you consider that it was achieved despite the tariffs that Donald Trump placed on many Chinese goods and those that China placed on U.S. goods in response. It also runs counter to the Biden administration's new rules preventing trade in certain high-technology items with the People's Republic. We are operating on two levels with China. One is geopolitical, where tensions have been growing rapidly, but the other is commercial, and it is determined largely by Chinese and American consumers and firms, not governments. That relationship remains deeply intertwined and interdependent. Can these two realms continue to move forward while working at cross purposes? It seems highly unlikely. In an essay in Foreign Affairs, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson notes that during the 2008 global financial crisis, good relations with China helped Washington avert another Great Depression. You see, China held massive amounts of American debt as well as American housing bonds issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Had Beijing sold those, it could have created a downward spiral for the American economy with fallout around the world. But Washington persuaded Beijing not to sell, and in fact, China used its own fiscal and monetary strength to boost the global economy. It's sobering to think that the next global financial crisis, for there will be one, will likely see none of that kind of policy coordination between the world's two largest economies. The geopolitical tensions are likely to grow fast. This week also brought news that was actually more significant than a wandering balloon. The U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees the U.S. nuclear arsenal, has informed Congress that China now has more land-based, fixed and mobile intercontinental ballistic missile launchers than the U.S. As relations between Washington and Beijing have deteriorated, Beijing has moved rapidly to build up its nuclear arsenal. It still has many fewer nuclear warheads than the U.S., but according to a Pentagon report last fall, it is on a path to more than triple its stock by 2035. At that point, we will be in a world in which three major powers each have large and sophisticated nuclear arsenals. And two of those powers, Russia and China, are allied, and both will be primarily targeting the United States. And then there is Taiwan. We face a long-term buildup of Beijing's military capability to invade, or more likely, blockade the island. But we also face potential short-term crises, including the one that will surely be triggered if House Speaker Kevin McCarthy does travel to the island and, even more provocatively, announces support for Taiwanese independence. Taiwan will be holding presidential elections in 2024. President Tsai Ing-wen cannot run again because of term limits, but her party has chosen as its likely candidate a man who says he is a worker for Taiwanese independence. So far, public sentiment suggests that most Taiwanese do not want independence right now, preferring for the time being the ambiguous status quo that has allowed them to thrive and prosper. But that too could change if Beijing's bullying ramps up. Right now, Washington and Beijing have few guardrails to keep problems from escalating. China and the United States have no bilateral arms control agreements, unlike with Russia, or even ongoing negotiations about security. There are no military-to-military dialogues about crisis management. There is no continuous discussion between the two sides' economic teams. If the next crisis between Beijing and Washington is bigger than a balloon, it might prove much harder to deflate. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week. Let me bring David Miliband and Richard Haas in on the U.S.-China relations discussion. David is the former British Foreign Secretary and now the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Richard is a former top State Department official, now the President of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of a new book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, which debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. Richard, I assume you think that the Biden administration, broadly speaking, handled the China episode pretty well. But I want to ask you, because you were the guy who Colin Powell dispatched to negotiate with the Chinese in that 2001 episode. And the way it was solved was the United States offered this regret, which the Chinese were able to interpret and translate as an apology. Given the political climate in Washington, where, the Republicans are just baying for blood on this, could you have solved the problem in that way this time?
I think the answer is we could have, but it would have come at greater political cost or price. There's almost a competition going on, Fareed, between the parties who can be tougher on China. Indeed, there's hardly a lot of difference between the Trump administration policy and now the Biden. And it's going to be difficult going forward. I mean, this was a balloon. Imagine we have a real crisis over, say, Taiwan, where ships or aircraft come into close proximity or contact. Well, how are the United States and China going to manage that? We don't seem to have the lines of communication. And the political environment has so deteriorated over the last 20 years. It's in some ways worse than the United States and the Soviet Union were at even the height of the Cold War.
You had said initially, you tweeted that you thought Tony Blinken should not have canceled his trip.
Right.
Do you think he should go as soon as possible?
Yes, sir, because when I look at the real differences between the United States and China over, say, Taiwan, that has more potential to bring the two into blows than anything else. Well, there's growing evidence of Chinese support for Russia and Ukraine, both direct and indirect, obviously economic support, but also potentially military support. So I think we have really pressing reasons to get the Secretary of State over there. I don't think it's necessarily going to cause, create miracles, but I don't see how we're served by not having a serious relationship. Plus, China clearly erred here. They got overly aggressive, even brazen. So I think this is not a bad moment.
David, one part of the sort of Biden administration strategy toward China, which is in some ways a continuation of the Trump administration, is this very tough economic competition. But it's competition not, there are two ways you can compete. One, you try to run faster, but the other is you try to trip the other guy. And there's a lot of us trying to trip the other guy, restraints on technology, restraints on exports. Do you think that Europe, broadly speaking, is on board with this strategy that the United States is adopting toward China?
Well, I think that Europeans have changed their tune significantly over the last 5 years. They will have been relieved last weekend that the administration was firm but not macho about this balloon incident. But they will be really urging that the cooperate part of the triad that says confront, compete and cooperate, that cooperate part gets filled out. Because at the moment, whether it be on global health or on the global climate, you see very little cooperation in areas that in themselves speak to the global commons and the responsibilities of great states. Then when you think about the Russia-China axis or link over Ukraine, the voting together on a whole range of issues at the UN, you see the parties very far apart, and if anything, cleaving further apart. And the great fear, I think not just in Europe actually, but across the rest of the world, is going to be that these two countries that are competing so ferociously, that the competition bleeds into every aspect of international relations and freezes out the kind of cooperation and diplomacy that is so essential.
Richard, when I was in India, I was talking to a bunch of Indian businessmen who were talking about how the big opportunity for them was now doing business in Russia, taking the businesses that Western firms had left behind. And it speaks to one of the reasons why the Russian economy is doing better than we think is there's a big world out there, and it's not just the West anymore. It's China and India, but also Turkey. Apparently, Iran's trade with Russia has gone up a lot. In that context, it seems this is a point Larry Summers made last week on the show. If we can't isolate Russia, it's going to be much harder to isolate China economically.
Oh, you can't isolate China. China's too big, and it's already too there. That horse has left the barn, and multiple horses have left multiple barns at the risk of stretching it. So it says a lot about sanctions. It turns out in government, almost every crisis, the first thing the State Department does is, you don't want to go to war, you don't want to do nothing, sanctions. We overuse the instrument, we ask way too much of it. And what you're suggesting is we're living in a world, particularly if China's the target of the sanctions, where the ability of sanctions to deliver is, I think, less and less and less. A country like India is going to potentially, though, gain twice. First, it's now trading with Russia, oil and other things. Then, where we do limit our relationship with China economically, guess what? India may be in a position to step in. Apple and others may one day be making their phones more in India than in China. So I think India might actually be fairly well positioned here.
What about Britain? We haven't had you on since the latest fiascos in Britain with, for example, the IMF now says Britain is going to be the worst performing major economy in the world. Is this all just the bitter fruit of Brexit?
Well, please don't introduce this as the fragile states section of the programme. That would just be too painful. Look, 2022 was a terrible year for the UK because its great virtues, which are meant to be pragmatism and stability and common sense, were thrown out of the window by a whole series of populist posturings by the governing party. I think the UK is getting back to some form of normal politics. The Labour Party is now under management that's electable. The Conservatives have got a leader, a Prime Minister, who at least exceeds his two predecessors. So you've got some form of centre-right, centre-left politics. But the hole left by Brexit is very, very large indeed, and it's getting deeper. It's getting deeper economically, and it's getting deeper politically. And at the moment, the ladders haven't been built to get us out of the hole. That's the real task ahead.
We are not prepared for assaults. Our battalion already has losses. Our command is far away from us. Communication is practically non-existent. The command never comes to us.
The local leadership does not care about us. They consider us expendable material. Their motto is, we'll fight to the last soldier, and then they'll send us more.
And who are those new ones? And just to emphasize, right, you hear each voice, but surrounded by groups who are showing their solidarity with the feelings. Well, these new ones that are coming to the front lines are still often coming straight from Putin's prisons. I spoke to the Russian journalist Maria Ovsyannikova today. Now, you may remember that she interrupted that live news broadcast last year. She's the one that walked there behind with the no war sign. Well, she was threatened with years in prison, told she'd be broken. And you're going to hear the unbelievable story of how she escaped Russia later tonight. But when I asked her about the prisoners now fighting in Ukraine, she said this.
You have to understand that no one wants to fight for Putin. Normal people don't want to fight for his palaces in Gelendzhik. Normal people don't support these vampires in the Kremlin. That is why he has nothing else left but to recruit prisoners for this criminal war.
They don't want to fight for Putin, she says, in his palaces, referring to him and his cronies in the Kremlin as vampires. Maybe it's because this is what they get in exchange. Just listen to what one prisoner told our Nick Payton Walsh in an exclusive report.
We walk around with bullet wounds, with shrapnel stuck in our legs. No one is being operated on.
No one is being operated on. Well, that same convict then told Nick that more than 90 of the 130 men in his group had been killed. 90 of 130. And that's the reality tonight. Putin is burning through soldiers at an unsustainable rate. Here's another data point. Today, we read a Norwegian intelligence report that said 3,000 men were called up to fight from Russia's Kola province, and half of them were killed in action. Just one other data point. They all say the same thing. And that same intelligence report from Norway also warning that Russia could resort to nukes against NATO if Putin feels an existential threat. It raises the obvious connection that losing such an incredible number of men could eventually lead to just that. And inside Putin's military, the infighting is getting more brazen and more public. Today, a telegram post tied to the Wagner Group slammed one of Putin's top generals. Now, it's so vulgar, I can't read most of it, but part of it reads, this pissy pants expletive is holed up at the command post, sending column after column of troops while the commander of one of the brigades involved in the storming of Vuhledar was killed at the line of contact. Column after column of men sent to die while their commanders hide. It is a damning statement. But as we've seen, the mass of men sent to die is true. Our producer, Tim Lester, on the ground tonight called it a, quote, mauling of Russian forces. And we have shown you some of these videos as we've obtained them that spotlight these individual moments of horrors that bring all this home. That man running on fire across a snow-ridden field. Russian soldiers being run over by their own, like rag dolls, that's their own tank. And we have a new video tonight to share with you. These are Russian tanks exploding as they are driving through a minefield. Soldiers then, some on fire, flee in every direction. We have a lot to get to tonight. I want to begin, though, with Nick Payton Walsh and his exclusive reporting, speaking to Russian convicts.
Any joy here is fleeting. This dance could be their last. Russian soldiers, most convicts here, living it up hours before being sent to the front lines. They fight to be pardoned, but here, over half died at the front, survivors said. Even some after they'd lived through the battles. Viktor Savalnev was jailed for armed robbery and assault, but taken out of prison and thrown into the worst fighting outside of Soledar. His unit, joking here before they assault a factory the next day, suffered catastrophic casualties, he told his wife. Viktor survived, but as he lay injured in hospital, he feared being dragged from his bed and executed for poor performance. This is his last message to his wife.
Я бы хотел бы вернуться назад, там, где я был. Они мне не дают. Я много очень людей потерял здесь. Это запомните, не посылайтесь за людей. Больше хватит. Они хотят всех убить.
Days later, his wife got a closed coffin back after a call from a soldier who said Viktor had died from shrapnel injuries. He's buried here, outside Moscow. There's something very different, though, about Savalnev to many of the prisoners sent to the front line to make up for Russia's devastating casualties. Most are sent by shadowy private military contractor Wagner, who in this propaganda video are keen to portray rare survivors coming back, joyful, grateful even, and last week claimed to have stopped recruiting in prisons altogether. But Savalnev and several convicts CNN has spoken to said they were hired from jail directly by the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's a remarkable use of convicts directly by Moscow, and Ukrainian intelligence says it's captured them on the front line.
Even among Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine, there are now those recruited into the private companies of the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation. They emphasize to us that they are not Wagner, but officially invited by the Defense Ministry. Here we hear echoes of internal squabbles in the Russian military leadership. Wagner's presence is being diluted with convicts directly controlled by the defense chiefs Shoigu and Gerasimov.
Recruitment has surged, these government figures showing a sudden 27,000 drop in the prison population last year when the scheme was just underway, with no apparent amnesty to explain it. A large proportion have died, with this Wagner training video showing one of the reckless tactics prisoners are used for, charging forwards together at the enemy. Savalnev was part of a unit called 08807, and its other frontline survivors know how hard it is to stay alive under the Ministry of Defense. We spoke to several from their hospital beds, hiding their identity. A former soldier jailed on drugs charges described being sent back twice to the front while injured.
We walk around with bullet wounds, with shrapnel stuck in our legs. No one is being operated on. We were 130 people, but have many amputees. There's probably less than 40 of us left.
Another, convicted on manslaughter, said half his unit became casualties.
We were sent to the very front. I radioed our guys that they were firing mortars at us, that they should aim a bit to the right, and they still shot at us, from both sides. Then I understood they were deliberately firing at us.
Erin, CNN reached out to the Russian Ministry of Defense for comment, and we haven't received a reply. But the fact that they could be getting in on the act of recruiting prisoners, something initially only done by the private mercenary company Wagner, shows the possibility of some kind of competition, tension between these two parts of Russia's military apparatus. And it also shows, too, that Moscow won't really stop at anything in its bid to try and regain momentum in its faltering invasion. Erin?
All right, Nick, thank you very much for that incredible exclusive report from Nick Payton-Walsh. Ian Bremmer's with me now, foreign policy expert, obviously writing and reporting exclusively and extensively on the war in Ukraine, president and founder of the Eurasia Group. So you see these videos of these prisoners being, trained to rush the enemy en masse. And, we've seen that, but that's a recruiting video. Just going to rush you through the forest, and they get mowed down. They send them anyway. Those exclusive conversations that Nick had with convicts, one saying 70% of the men in his group are dead or amputees. They're sent back out. Is this mass death doing any damage to Putin?
I wouldn't say it is. I think the level of control that Putin has over the information environment in Russia is overwhelming. I think the anger of the Russian people towards the United States, towards NATO, the humiliation they feel. They believe they're not just fighting the Ukrainians, but they're fighting the West as a whole, the training, the intelligence, the weaponry. So, no, he still has very significant support. And keep in mind, as horrible as the treatment that these Russian soldiers, former convicts, are receiving, the Russian economy has been standing up relatively well, about a 3.5% contraction over the last 12 months.
That's it.
Compared to about 40% for the Ukrainians. So, if anyone is suffering here, let's be clear, it's the 44 million Ukrainians, vastly more than the Russian homeland and its citizenry.
And I think it is so crucial you say that, because when people say, well, aren't there the sanctions? Yeah, but there's a whole lot more that could be done that hasn't been done. You look at 3.5% contraction versus 44%.
It takes time. It takes time.
So within this context, Nick's talking about this recruiting now, not just the Wagner Group and Prigozhin from the prisons,
Correct.
but also the actual formal Russian military itself. And there's this fight between these two groups. So in that context, that Telegram quote that I read, I just want to share it again. This pissy pants expletive, is just lucky that he is not near fighters who would have 200'd him, which means to kill, just like they 200 other super intelligent commanders on the ground. Prigozhin again going after the Russian military, right? Insulting them. But this is so public and vulgar. So, what do you read into that?
Well, the head of this Wagner Group is responsible for one of the only significant victories that the Ukrainians have had really since the beginning of this war. And as a consequence, he feels emboldened. He has certainly taken on publicly inside Russia some of the regular forces and their leaders, the commanders. It's one of the reasons why Gerasimov was moved in his position, have direct control on the ground in Ukraine. Putin wants to show that he's still very much in charge through the official lines. Look, none of this, if you're asking me, does this mean that Prigozhin is suddenly going to be a competitor to the throne in Russia? Not if he knows what's good for him. And he's been very clear. He did an interview, very unusual interview, just a few days ago where he says, of course, I don't have any political ambitions myself. Yeah, he better be saying that, because the alternative is a very quick ouster.
Right, as others have found out. So in the context of this, Elon Musk. Now, you've spoken in depth with him about Ukraine. He again has blocked Starlink from the Ukrainian military, is the latest that we know. Now, it's impossible to overstate the importance of Starlink to Ukraine. Tom Zelensky the other day was telling me, basically we wouldn't be here without it, right? Correct. It has been that instrumental. They admit it. Musk defended blocking it in response to criticism from astronaut Scott Kelly. And Musk said, quote, Starlink is the communication backbone of Ukraine, especially at the front lines, where almost all other internet connectivity has been destroyed. So Musk acknowledges. Then he says, but we will not enable escalation of conflict that may lead to World War III.
Yeah, which he said before. The criticism here that we're seeing is about not being able to use Starlink for drone surveillance directly that would then be allowed to blow up targeting. And the contract that has been signed, where the Starlink is being provided for free to the Ukrainians, is for humanitarian purposes. So he's absolutely within the context of what they're doing. When I was at Davos, I met with a large number of Ukrainian officials, some of whom are directly involved in this program.
Yes.
And at this point, which was only about 3 weeks ago, they did say that right now they're getting 100% of what they need from SpaceX and Starlink, which I was quite gratified to hear. It is not what I was hearing a few months ago.
So, and you think so even with this?
This only came up a few days ago.
So it's unclear
honestly,
what the impact.
It does seem. Look, again, I want to be clear. If it wasn't for Starlink and Microsoft with the cloud and the cybersecurity in the early days of the war, it's not clear to me that Zelensky's still even there. So don't underestimate the importance of these United States technology companies and what they've done. The danger, of course, is those decisions are in the hands of a very small number of individuals who can change their mind at any moment.
Right.
And I think that's a very important point for us to remember.
Right, and who are individuals and
That's right.
money as a motive, other things too, perhaps, but they're not state actors is the point.
They're not responsible to the citizens. They certainly are not.
All right, Ian, thank you very much.
Sure.